Hello and welcome to Shape the System, where we find and tell the stories that help people to rethink the way the world works. We interview people from all over the world who are helping to change our systems for the better. Shape the System is an independent podcast with support from KPMG High Growth Ventures, who help ambitious founders and their teams scale up for success. More about KPMG High Growth Ventures after the interview. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the show. I've got a whole bunch of topics we're going to talk about today, but they're going to roll down and up to, whichever way you want to think about it, to sustainability and impact, kind of what we're always talking about, but not necessarily a specific type of impact, but the mechanism by which impact might be achieved. So it's a kind of a meta on a meta today, which I'm really excited about. We're joined by Simon Schillebeeckx from a company called Handprint. And normally we start with the problem space, and I actually just said to Simon that's exactly where we're going to start. But I do want to start with some terminology first, because the terminology here was quite interesting to me, and I think let's dive into this because some of this is your background. So Simon, welcome to the show, and tell us a little bit about the company where you're from, and then also let's talk about what a handprint is, because I'm fascinated by this.
Hi, Vincent. Thanks so much for having me. So my background is in academia and environmental sustainability, and I co-founded Handprint at the end of 2019 to try to make more of a difference in the world than I could do just being an academic, teaching students and doing academic research. And the scientific concept Handprint, which we've adopted as our company name, really is the counterpart of the more well-known footprint. So footprint is all of the bad shit companies do and that has a negative impact on the planet, or they're trying to make consumers feel guilty for their footprint. Handprint's really the flip side of that, and it's the sum of all the positive impacts one creates through deliberate action that leaves a positive outcome, that creates positive outcomes for the planet. So a handprint can be achieved by supporting education, planting trees, restoring corals, just in general making life on this planet better. And so that's the main goal of our organization.
Wonderful. Good. And because this, I mean, what's curious to me is we've been in this show for just over 4 years. I've obviously been interested in impact for ages, and I've never come across this term, but this term makes such obvious sense. What's the genesis of this term? Is this in academic circles and it's never been in the wild, or?
Yeah, it actually originates, if I'm correct, in 2011 in MIT. So I don't remember the name of the professor. That's bad. But so there was basically a professor who worked on life cycle analysis, right? And so life cycle analysis is this scientific approach to evaluating the long-term environmental impact of a product or service, originating from all the way down to raw material extraction, all the way till the end of life and the recycling period. And he argued that that we were missing a fundamental part of products when we looked at life cycle analysis really only from the negative side up, and tried to kind of disentangle all of the negative impacts that a product might create through its life cycle, and then call that a footprint. And he proposed the name of Handprint as a more holistic perspective that would also explicitly consider positive impacts that a product or a service might generate. And then started doing some work on how we could actually use lifecycle analysis databases in order to quantify and qualify what these positive impacts might be. And from there, it kind of took a bit of a life of its own. It got adopted by the World Economic Forum, researchers at Harvard. And then it kind of really became intertwined with the more recent movement in sustainability on regeneration and the restoration of nature, which then is intimately tied to the idea of handprints, creating positive impact.
Yeah, it's a wonderful, I mean, so much of how we think about this is just not easy to kind of sum up and explain. And the idea that everyone now knows what a footprint is and can easily translate to something else, you know, that you can attach to the human body. I think it's wonderful. I want to come back to something that you kind of hinted at, and was one of the questions I had coming into the talk today. And it's quite a large one. We might not get through this in a minute, but have we kind of got capitalism wrong?
Oh, absolutely.
So can you just that short on it?
Well, I mean, if you think about, I like to think about this from a big systems perspective, right? So we've pretty much had three different attempts at creating some kind of economic system in the history of the world, right? For the longest period of time, we were in a reasonably ecological model, right? Where most value that we perceive to be as humans was kind of derived directly from nature, hunter-gatherer societies. And so we were in this kind of ecological model where everything was perfectly in balance and we were not really in control of anything. We were kind of living by the elements. And this ecological model probably persisted for hundreds of thousands of years, right? Mm-hmm. And then at some point, with the advent of more advanced technology and advanced scientific thinking, new types of economic models were starting to emerge. And the two dominant ones really are financial capitalism and Marxism, right? And financial capitalism assumes that the fundamental scarcity is money. And as a consequence, finance is the most important contribution you can make to an organization. And that's given rise to shareholder capitalism and the capitalist economy in which we are living today, which has led to a massive aggregation and kind of convergence of wealth in the hands of very few. Marxism was a different approach that basically said the most scarce resource and the most valuable resource there is on this planet is human labor. Mm-hmm. And as a consequence, power should reside with the labor force. And that has not worked, right? Clearly, all of the attempts at kind of developing communist and Marxist approaches has not really worked. But all three are fundamentally flawed. Because right now, I mean, to have a financial system or economic system in which the assumption, the underlying core idea is that money is scarce is absurd. There is an insane amount of money. It's just not very well distributed, right? And at the same time saying, I mean, and also this kind of financial capitalism has kind of led to the reduction, really, of nature into something that we can exploit. And that's given rise to this exploitative economy that we've built since the Industrial Revolution. And also that labor is something that we can exploit. And that's given rise to all of these labor issues and kind of turning people into functional cogs in a productive machinery. And so I think what a better system is one that fundamentally recognizes that there needs to be balance between those three things. And that's really been the core idea behind the triple bottom line, as was in 1995, John Elkington came up with that. And then, of course, ESG and corporate social responsibility, which have all tried to say, like, look, we need to merge these three different core systems of economic activity into something in which the three core ecosystems of social, environment, and economic are in balance.
Right. Yeah. I find it fascinating because I think about some of the kind of markers that are in the zeitgeist. And, you know, I didn't live in the 50s and the 60s, but my observation of what I understand was such a period of post-war growth that people just thought about, you know, growth forever and hadn't really fully considered. Some people, the vast majority, hadn't considered the Earth as a constrained system with a finite amount of resources or ability to contain a certain number of people operating or consuming at certain levels. And then sometime sort of post the 70s and coming into, and you're going to know this better than I, obviously, and it's a leading question specifically, we started to kind of move into more of a kind of, and I'm going to sum it up as a do no evil period. And I'm kind of paraphrasing Google's kind of motto, but we kind of moved from, we can't just do whatever we want here and good growth is good and greed is good. We kind of need to make sure we don't do the wrong thing, kind of footprint related rather than handprint related. And then we seem to now be kind of moving into a state where people, their expectation of themselves and their companies, we can't just do not bad, we have to do but good. Can you help me understand how this kind of arc of this story has got us to where we are today?
I think this analogy that you're using here of do no evil to do good is perfect. It's really what I would argue is an evolution that we've been seeing really since maybe the mid-2010s, that the classic approach to sustainability, which is the do no evil approach, is fundamentally flawed and is maybe more than flawed, is highly exclusionary. And so if we think about the classic approach to sustainability, the focus is on how do we reduce our negative impact on society, right? And it's kind of epitomized in this reduce, reuse, recycle adagio that has been so popular since Lansing in the Netherlands kind of proposed it, and like has become almost the dogmatic way of thinking about how we should prioritize sustainability efforts. Reduce, reuse, recycle. And that's a good idea, but the fundamental challenge with that idea is that it is really only suitable for companies that are in the business of making things, moving things, or extracting resources. Right. And so if you think about manufacturing organizations, if you think about transportation organizations, you think about the mining companies, energy companies, all of those are, by virtue of what they do, they have a very negative impact on the planet. Right? So they have a very large footprint. And as a consequence, for them, the priority should absolutely be reduce, reuse, recycle. Right? And the challenge that we face, especially since the 90s, is that the vast majority of global GDP doesn't come from those kind of organizations. Right? So we have a service industry that's significantly larger than our production industry. We have digital and tech companies. We have a lot of governmental and non-governmental organizations. And the God honest truth is that by and large, if you're in the service industry, you've got nothing to do with sustainability. And that is a massive problem, because you hear like the McKinseys and the big consultancies or the accounting firms talking about like, oh yeah, we're doing all these things for sustainability, which comes down to we switch off our lights when we leave the office, we print less, and we minimize the number of flights we take. And I'm like, boo-hoo. but that's really it, because the mindset is just we are trying to minimize our negative impact. And that is so unambitious. And so the fundamental problem that I see with how classic sustainability has been approached over the last 30, 40 years, and especially now how it has become part of a regulatory framework in the US, in Singapore, in Europe especially, is that it forces and enshrines this way of thinking into law without recognizing that this way of thinking is absolutely useless for the vast majority of companies that are in those territories, because they can't do anything about it. And I think this is really the key problem, right? Because if you think about this at the individual level, one of the key things you hear from individuals is this sense of disempowerment, right? So they're like, oh, we want to do something, but we feel so powerless. What can we do? Right? And it's really anchored in this footprint thinking. Because then at some point it's like, oh yeah, so the only things we can do is do less of something, right? We have to buy less plastic bottles, and we have to fly less, and we eat less meat, and all of this. Yeah, all of these things obviously make some difference around the margins, but it's a mindset of doing less that is, first of all, anathema to capitalism, and secondly, is not aspirational at all. Like very few people get excited about neutrality. I'd always say like not even the Swiss get excited about neutrality. And so the core challenge there is how do we not necessarily flip completely, but how do we bring this mindset shift around that companies that want to be on the vanguard of sustainability are not just focused on doing less bad, but really think about how do we create positive impact as part of our business model, and use that to create amazing results for the planet, but also competitive advantage. And I think that's what we've started to see since 2015, 2016. Companies have started to do this. And I think that holds a lot of promise, both for business growth in general, as well as for planetary health.
Yeah. And there's a couple of things that I definitely want to get to. We're going to segue shortly to Handprint specifically. But something you touched on there that I found quite interesting, and I was thinking about this before the show, which is why is it that the regulatory framework kind of focuses on the footprint, on the negatives, on the things you shouldn't do? Is it that's easier to measure? It's easier to define? It's hard to define upside? Like, why is it?
No, it's way harder to define.
Right.
No, I think the real reason why this is the case is because, I mean, at the carbon level, it really grew out of the Kyoto Protocol, right? And so the Kyoto Protocol, for those who don't know, was this kind of first global agreement on carbon emissions that was signed into law in 1997 and kind of came into effect in 2005. In 2005, at the same time, almost as the Kyoto Protocol came into effect, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which was the translation of a global agreement on countries around carbon emissions, into how do we translate this to the corporate level. And so that translation document became super influential, right? And it still defines how companies should account for their scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions, all of those things. And so, but it only focused on negative impact, right? And it kind of created this, I would say, very complex system of measurement that forces companies to take into account very wide spheres of influence. And there's very good reasons for this, but it creates enormous measurement complexity. And if you see the sustainability space now, especially the sustainable consulting space now, we're spending hundreds of billions a year on sustainability consultants and on sustainability reports to really measure and report on the negative impact of a company under the, I would say, misguided belief that measurement leads to improvement. There's unfortunately very little evidence that measurement of any negative impact leads to consistent improvement. So the reason why we've adopted this approach, I think, is really because the intuitive way of thinking about responsibility is the polluter pays. Right? If you're doing something bad for the environment, you need to undo that. Right? It's very sensible. It's the oldest principle in environmental thinking is the polluter pays. Right? That's why we have loads of laws on like the ozone layer protection, like CFCs. We have Clean Air Act. It's like you have to make the polluter responsible. And sustainability reporting, as well as kind of carbon accounting, are all consequences of that core principle. And my personal opinion is that in the current state of the world, the polluter pays is fundamentally outdated as a principle. And it shouldn't be our guiding principle anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I was at a talk attended a talk a couple of months ago, and I no doubt heard this refrain, but I just think worth kind of repeating in this context, which was this idea that we just can't cut our way to zero, in this context, zero emissions. Ultimately, there has to be some generation of something that replaces the thing, because it's just not possible to get to zero or even negative with only cuts. You actually have to produce something new that just takes us forward. And what's interesting about something you just said as well for me is it's ironic that a capitalistic way of thinking would focus on a constrained get to zero option rather than a how do we get to 100. Like capitalist thinking by its nature is unconstrained. And so you'd be thinking that was a capitalist mind would solve this kind of problem with that type of thinking rather than the other way around. I just want to link to something that you just said before as well around this creation of enterprise value through some of this thinking. You talked about from 2015 onwards, starting to see the emergence of some of this. Help me understand how thinking more about handprints and the creation of positive outcomes, not just minimizing negative outcomes, is actually starting to translate to enterprise value?
So, and this is a big challenge, right? I think if we look at this kind of at a global level, on a yearly basis, the kind of shortfall that we have in funding for the Sustainable Development Goals is about $3.4 trillion US. That's an insane amount of money. But in the grand scheme of things, like into global GDP, and so it's not even that much, but it's a lot of money. And the key problem here is that investing in sustainable development, investing in nature, doesn't generate the kind of return on investment that companies have come to expect and that shareholders have come to expect. Because the underlying assets that you're investing in, whether it's coral restoration, whether it's ocean health, whether it's access to education for the poor or access to food for the hungry, doesn't generate returns. And as a consequence, corporates don't invest in this. Now, what has happened, of course, in the last decennia is that more and more people have become aware of these problems and developed some kind of care about this. And this affects companies' ability to hire, this affects companies' ability to attract customers and retain loyal customers. And so the central thesis, I think, of Handprint, my company, but also of what we see emerge in the regenerative economy, is that the returns on nature or the returns on sustainable development cannot come from the asset itself. Right? It's not if you're going to invest in tree planting that suddenly these trees have monetary value. Now, there are people that are trying to do this, but it's just not the case right now in the economy. What does work is that if you're integrating these kind of micro contributions into your business processes, and especially the interactions the company has with its stakeholders, with its customers, with its employees, with its audience, if you're doing this, then you're fundamentally changing the nature of that interaction. And that has a lot of value. And so we've seen in lots of experiments that we've done that if you're doing this well, you can actually boost your underlying business metrics. And that's where the returns can come from. And so I think the big promise of this idea of integrating handprints into business processes is that it's pretty easy, especially likened to reduce, reuse, recycle. It's potentially very quickly influential, so the returns are not very far away, and it's inclusion. It's inclusive. Like every company can do this, whether you're in the service industry, in the digital industry, and even if you're in the classic polluting industries, you can all do this, and it can create massive environmental gains, massive social gains, as well as very positive effects on business.
I definitely want to understand some of the spectrum of possible use cases, because I think that's one of the things that's interesting to me looking at your product specifically. But just in terms of like the one or two kind of standout examples where it's been integrated into like the actual flow or the nature of the kind of the customer experience. Give me one or two of those stories. So I think some of the ones that I found before we got on the show, I was like, wow, that's an absolute eye-opener. I'd love to hear some more about one of those, two of those.
Right. So a very cool one that we did was with an Australian sports company in the e-commerce sector. So they had this, they have a big platform. They were interested in doing something good for the world. But they were also a bit skeptical on like, is it actually going to affect our bottom line? Right. And so what we set up together with them in Google was an A/B testing of their checkout process. So basically, for a period of 2 weeks, we sent 50% of site visitors to the original website without any changes, and 50% of site visitors to the website where we had integrated in the checkout a plugin that said, if you buy this product, we will plant a tree in Australia. Right. And of course, we made sure that that actually happened. So we ran this for 2 weeks. And what we saw after 2 weeks, and so Google optimized the analysis, was that the site where the Handprint plugin was implemented had 16% more sales. 16% reduction in cart abandonment, which in e-commerce is a massive issue, right? People put stuff like window shopping in carts and don't buy. And that creates lots of inventory issues. But the 16% increase in sales led, of course, to, roughly speaking, a 16% increase in revenue. And then if we looked at the margin on products, it meant that the money they spent on planting trees was 6 times earned back in terms of additional sales. So that is a very powerful case study because it shows that even if you don't give a rat's ass about any of this, if you just want to pad your bottom line, you should still do it. Right? And I think that's really interesting. Now, of course, people can say then that that's greenwashing but then you're facilitating more sales and sales itself have a negative impact on the world. And all of that's true, but we can't fundamentally overthrow the system. I think what we can do is try to solve critical challenges in capitalist system that are currently there. And for many people, one of the key challenges is like they are keen to buy more sustainable products, but they don't know how, they don't know where, they don't know where to find them. And typically they're much more expensive. And so the idea that we had, like, if you just make the transaction itself good for the world, rather than the product, then you make it much more accessible to every organization in the world.
Mhm.
So that's one case study I think is really interesting. Another one that we did was with Uber Eats in Japan, and was in the advertising industry. So we worked with an ad tech platform called Teats. And what Teats does is they put ads on publisher content, whether on mobile or on laptops or on desktops. So if you go to news sites and you see an ad there, like 9 out of 10, it's put there by Teats. So they have a very big network of these kind of publishers. And Uber was interested in boosting awareness and positive brand recall with elderly people in Japan. And so what they said were, we're going to support an organization called Good Neighbors Japan that is basically providing food to elderly people with financial distress. And so we worked with Teats. What we did was we did this marketing campaign, advertising campaign with Uber, and we integrated in the ad, the bottom of the creative, so a message that said this ad provides access to food. And people could click on that little banner and then find out exactly how Uber was going to do this. But people could also just watch the ad. And we did before and after surveys in Japan to figure out like how do people actually perceive this. And the three main results were that there was a 9% increase in positive brand recall before and after with the target audience. There was a 32% increase in click-through rate on the ad, above industry averages. And there was a 50% increase in ad completion rate. So people watched the entire ad rather than only part of it. Those are massive results in advertising. These are really, really significant results. And the only difference with this campaign was that they added this credible impact. And so for an advertiser to have these kind of results, they're very, very powerful. And then figuring out, okay, how much money can we actually spend on this positive impact in order to make sure that kind of balances out with the additional benefits is possible. We can literally quantify that. So it's another example of how companies can use this kind of technology or these ideas in order to really have win-win situations.
Yeah, I find it fascinating. I just think the thing you said specifically before, which was this idea of building the impact into the transaction rather than the product, is a massive shift, because if I think about the world in the early 2000s and the kind of the Tom's shoes version of the world, you buy the shoe and we'll give a pair away, ignoring the fact that there was some bunch of externalities that were not desirable when they did that. Separate podcast, separate story. But the idea that there's this consistent flow of transactions happening all the time, and that's actually an amazing leverage point to be able to say, what if those transactions could all be enabled, is I just think a fascinating take on it. So then kind of coming back out of this from, okay, if someone looked at the e-commerce example and says, well, they were still buying products and that has a negative thing, that'd be better if the world would be better, ignores the fact, as you said, that the vast majority of GDP now is service-based businesses where there is no physical product. So buying more of the service is not going to create more, other than maybe some more electricity being used. To help me understand kind of, the spectrum, you talked about this being very, very accessible down to the kind of the smallest business that in the case specifically of Handprint, I mean, you guys have a free option. Like if you're a bakery down the road that wants to do something, I always use bakery for some reason, or your Uber, as your example in Japan, and everything in between, like, is that now where we're at the point where literally any business or any type of organization can kind of pull this stuff in?
Yeah, I really think every type of organization can do this. The key challenge for smaller organizations still remains, how do we build the credible engagement around this, right? So if you're a bakery somewhere, let's say somewhere in Sydney, and you want to do this, then the simplest thing to do is saying, like, we're going to link this to either the sale of specific products or just to revenue, right? So which is very kind of easy metric. And we say 1% of revenue is going to this kind of good cause, right? Doing this is pretty straightforward. You put a sticker on your window and you say, we're going to do this. And then some people might be attracted to that. Turning that into really an engagement strategy is a bit harder, because how do you get people really involved in this? That's the key challenge. Part of that is potentially using like a digital POS, a point of sale system, where you can visualize this at the transaction level. But then, of course, this requires integration with the API, and there's some complexity there. But that could work. The other thing you could do is kind of in the form of almost like a lottery, right? So where you accumulate the funds, let's say for 1 month of transactions, then you enable your loyal customers to draw from a lottery and say, okay, one of them is going to be able to choose where we are going to allocate this money. And then we create that kind of digital experience. And then depending on what people care about in my community, we will be able to support different types of causes. And that becomes a bit more interesting, because then becomes really a story that is being told in the community. Like, oh, I happen to win the lottery. I chose this project. I've also been able to submit a project that I care about. And then maybe next time somebody will be able to do that. And I think then it becomes something that really drives much more, potentially could drive traffic, could drive engagement. And that is then the cool thing if it happens in isolation. Now, if it happens at an ecosystem level where it's not only the bakery, but it's also the provider of the point of sale system and potentially the bank, that is the bank card, then you have 3 different actors that can jointly contribute, potentially topped up by the consumer. But then it becomes something that's really powerful, because then you can establish networks of impact. And so I think this is really the world we hope to co-create, is in this kind of world in which financial transactions, but not only financial transactions, also exchanges of attention and likes on a social media network can all create this quantifiable positive impact and lead to real world impact over time. And I think then it becomes something that is much bigger than a single organization and much more powerful.
Yeah, that's actually, just as you're sort of saying that and reflecting a bit on this idea of a transaction, it doesn't have to be a transaction of monetary exchange for product or service. It can just be an interaction that is transactional in nature as part of a larger engagement. I think about, there's probably a couple of things in here that kind of examples that come straight to mind. One was this is actually the purchase, but there's a burger joint in Australia. There may be elsewhere as well. And when you buy a burger, they hand you a beer, the top of a beer can, a beer bottle, like like the lid. And you're like, what am I supposed to do with this? Like, I just gave you money. Why are you giving me this back? And they're like, oh, we'll put it in there's 3 buckets out there that represent 3 local causes, and you can choose which one of those you want to put in. At the end of the month, the one with the most things is the one we're giving the money to. And it's an interaction or a moment or a transaction that they've created over and above buying the burger that kind of enables you to be empowered. It's brilliant. It works really well. I guess my kind of question related to that example is, that's done in quite a physical sense. It's misses out, therefore, on the multitude of transactions that happen in a digital sense. Is this kind of where Handprint sees itself really fundamentally playing in engaging and creating and I guess creating value out of these potential digital transactions?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I just kind of broaden it, right? So if you're thinking about any organization, especially think about organizations that mainly occupy the digital realm. So every kind of company has a North Star metric, whether they know it or not, right? So if you're a podcast host, the North Star metric might be monthly downloads or monthly listeners, right? So if you can connect that North Star metric to a credible commitment to do something good, then as you become more successful, your positive impact, your handprint is going to grow, right? And I think that's really possible in the digital space. It's possible, like the example you gave, I think is great in the physical space, but again, it requires an ex-ante financial transaction, which might not be available for everyone, right? So, because many companies, like a podcast host, I like to use this example. Well, there is no ex-ante financial transaction, but you can still say, well, the most important thing for me is going to be monthly listeners, because that's potentially going to grow advertising revenue and all of that. And so I'm connecting that North Star metric to a credible commitment. I'm communicating about it, and it might actually drive attention as well over time. So what we can imagine ourselves becoming really is the core infrastructure that enables this. And so for us, the big thing we're focusing on in 2024 is to integrate in retail banking applications. Right, so where we've built a technology together with a partner to create a loyalty point system that can exist within the bank, in the bank's mobile app, that people earn points as they engage in variety of behaviors. Some of them will be bank card transactions. Others might be monthly saving or paying off your mortgage, right? Mm-hmm. So things that are desirable. And the bank can reward you for desirable behavior with points. Those points can then be transferred into project support that you choose and can track. And that's very important. You can track what happens with that money within the banking app itself. So for the bank, it creates loyalty, it creates attention, it creates stickiness, which are all key things that they care about, and it potentially incentivizes desirable behaviors. Whereas the price of doing this is actually extremely cheap. So the key example of this is Alipay in China that have launched this Ant Forest micro app within its Alipay ecosystem that is a loyalty point system that plants trees. And they've planted 600 million trees over the last 8 years.
600 million?
Yeah, something like that. And wow. They're doing this for almost no money because their loyalty point system is ingenious because it's gamified and it's fun, but it creates so much attention. It probably costs $2 or $3 per year per user, which is very little for a loyalty program. And it creates a system where most of my Chinese students that use Alipay say, the first thing I do in the morning is open Alipay. Yeah. It's not TikTok, it's not other social media, it's not the news, it's not email, it's my bank. That's insane.
Yeah. And they did that by basically...
That is available to all banks.
Making it evergreen, essentially. They were like, if you don't log in every day, then the contribution of... It's like you get a streak or something. Is that how they instrument it?
It's even smarter than that. It's if you don't log in, and that's really the complexity of the Alipay system, your friends can steal your points that you earned the day before. And that's the gamification. It's a super simple thing, but it's in my knowledge, it's the first loyalty point system that is fundamentally social. And that is so smart. If you build a system like that, it just creates this stickiness, because if you don't log in, some of your friends they'll steal your points. If you log in before your friends, you can steal their points. It creates this attention. Plus it stimulates collective action. So it has all of the right incentives. And then if you think about the cost of this, so of course, developing this system was expensive. I have no idea what the capex on it was. But right now, in terms of operating it, it's super cheap. Because if you think, like, there's a great example, like Maybank here in Singapore recently launched a new bank card. Right? And they worked with one of our impact partners, 7 Clean Seas, to remove 150 kilos of plastic from the ocean as part of the launch of this plastic-free or plastic-neutral bank card. So everyone who signed up to the new bank card, Maybank would finance the removal of 150 kilo of plastic from the ocean. Great initiative. I have no idea whether it was successful. But removing 150 kilo of plastic from the ocean probably costs like between 150 and $300. So that's a substantial investment in the launch of a new product, right? And you don't know if it creates any loyalty, because someone might sign up for the bank card and after 1 year say, well, I want something else. And so it's a high risk for a company to do this. I'm supportive of this, but it's just not something that creates a lot of stickiness. If you don't have a customer experience that brings people back and back, that over time grows impact, you're really taking a very big risk. Like when I opened my bank account in Singapore, the bank gave me a suitcase. That seems to be the default gift of a bank in Singapore. You get a suitcase, which probably costs like $30 or $50.
Sure.
It's a substantial investment. I might have left the bank. I haven't, because people are lazy, of course. But so you're giving someone a suitcase. That's a substantial investment. That's your welcome package. If you can turn that into something that creates way more stickiness, as a bank, you will save money and you will get customers that are loyal because they like you rather than because they're lazy, which is the default for banks, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I find it fascinating. I want to just kind of get into this example that you've just provided, or a couple of the examples you've provided. And I know there's a spectrum here, right? Like if we talk about the bakery option where someone's like, I just want the sticker on my thing and I come in, the barrier to entry is actually quite low, right? Even with Handprint specifically, but even more broadly, it's very, very low. But where you're actually trying to make it an integrated part of the equation, what are the 2 or 3 big rocks that these enterprises that you're dealing with or working to deal with having to solve, and where does Handprint fit into all that?
I think the key challenge that companies need to solve, one is convincing themselves that this is actually going to work, right? That's still the biggest challenge. And if it requires technological integration, that makes it significantly harder, because then it means you're accepting you're going to invest in something without really knowing what the returns are going to be, which is, of course, what companies always do. But the returns are harder to predict. So the ideal case, I think, is that you can start with something that doesn't require technological integration. And then over time, if you see that it kind of works, then build the technological integration. So let me give you an example here. So one of our clients is called Tunes. They are a B2B fintech company that facilitates international money movement. No consumer will ever know them. They are in the back of the back. So they are, if you want to move money internationally using like e-Visa, so they work with Visa, it will happen through Tunes. If you want to move money as an alternative to the SWIFT banking system, which is also something most consumers don't really know, then you can use Tunes to do it faster, cheaper, and so. And so they were interested in what we're doing. They've supported us from the beginning. And they recently made this pledge, like for every 5,000 transactions that move through our system, we are going to plant one tree. That's a very simple kind of North Star metric. The transaction volume is what drives their success. More transactions means more fees, means more business, means more growth. But it's also a very powerful sales argument, because there are, of course, competitors that are not doing this. And so in their sales decks, this is something that they can say, like, look, you're working with us. Every time you move money through our system, we're going to do this positive impact. Now, they announced it, and then I think a week later, they won a sustainability award for innovative sustainability application in fintech. Now, they don't have an integration. By lack of having an integration, there is a trust credibility issue. In the beginning, you can probably get away with that. It's not an issue. You just make sure that you pay on a monthly basis. You're sharing how many transactions you have with us, how many transactions have moved through your system, and you're kind of financing the trees, and then everything else, that's what we make sure happens. So, but over time, if you really want to make the most out of this, you need to build a technological integration so that our API can basically see how many transactions are happening. And then every time that 5,000 transactions have happened, ping us a message, say, Tunes commits to plant another tree. That would be step one. Step two would be the API becomes a bit more intelligent and says, we're going to qualify for each sender or each recipient how many transactions are being sent. So does this transaction come from Visa? Does it come from WeChat? Does it come from Alipay? Does it come from this bank? Right? And then we can qualify this and then say, okay, at the end of a month or at the end of a year, okay, this client specifically, this Tunes client specifically, has enabled the planting of this many trees. And that becomes a communication story again. That leads to more engagement, right? And so over time, building the integration adds to the credibility of what you're doing, because otherwise you rely on, well, them providing truthful information, which of course there's a risk of opportunism. There's a risk of saying like, oh, we had a lot more transactions than we expected. We don't want to plant as many trees. So it's harder for us to certify that what they're claiming is real. Once you build a tech integration, it becomes possible. So, but I think over time, companies can kind of start small and then build the more complex integrations as and when they see this actually adds value. And that's really the model for, to get to client adoption.
Yeah, and there's a couple of other features that I found quite interesting in Handprint specifically. One of these was this idea of kind of impact counters, so I want to talk about those. And the other thing was it featured quite heavily in all of the different kind of options, the tiered options, that this idea of the photos and kind of the visual proof that kind of closes the loop that says we actually did the thing that you said you were going to do. So let's talk about the counters and let's talk about kind of the media that's associated with the programs that you kind of plug into.
Right. So I think what we're trying to solve here is visualization, right? So visualization, because it leads to kind of soft credibility. And so in the impact space, if you really want to be credible, typically the solution that is provided is auditing, right? So you're going to audit a reforestation project and then kind of say, okay, this many trees have been planted, this many trees survive, all of this kind of stuff. Valuable, extremely expensive. Right. And as a consequence, not available to every company to finance this kind of expensive work. The impact counters really are a way of creating instant gratification. which is so important in this day and age, that if you're doing something, you want to be able to see immediately some number go up, right? So you're going on a website, you're buying a product, number goes up. People are happy because it creates this kind of dopamine rush saying, oh, actually something good happened. Now, of course, this creates the misconception maybe that, oh, I bought this t-shirt and instantly a tree was planted, which obviously is nonsense. It takes time, right? There's a whole process behind this. But I think the impact counters are kind of demonstrating the commitment of the firm. And over time, this commitment will materialize and really create the impact that is set. And of course, that's what we do. And we have to make sure that this is real. Otherwise, we will fail as an organization. The images and the videos are really a way of kind of establishing that emotional connection, right? Because very often you see this in organizations, right? So they are keen to do something, but what they really want to do is send a few of their employees over to the space where the impact is created so that they can kind of experience it firsthand. That's understandable, but it's typically not very sustainable, right? So volunteer labor is not sustainable, right? Getting people to amateurs to go to a forest and say, we want to plant some trees as well for 2 days, basically means that actual work is not happening, because then you become a sustainable tourism destination rather than a reforestation group. So, but the visualization remains important because you want people to have this sense of like, oh, I can actually see what's happening on the ground. I can see the updates. Like, we're doing this coral restoration project, and on a month-by-month basis, I will see pictures of how this coral is evolving from very small to a flourishing biome with lots of fish and lots of species. And I get the stories of the new species that emerge, and I learn something. And that's, I think, very important to create that long-term engagement. The other thing that's, I think, really valuable there is for organizations that have access to our technology and have access to all of these images, is that they can use those to create new touch points with their customers, right? So again, the e-commerce example is simple, but it works in any other organization, like let's say for an employee engagement application, where you as a company can say, oh, remember 4 months ago, we did this big campaign around ocean plastic cleanup. And you send to all your employees, like, here are a bunch of updates from that project. Like, this much plastic has been removed. This is what happened. And that creates this kind of, feel good moment that might then stimulate further loyalty and reduce turnover, which are all valuable. Similarly, you can do this with your customers and kind of ping them information a couple months later and say, hey, 3 months ago, we did this campaign and all of you together chose to do reforestation, coral restoration, and help building a school. And here is a video of each of one. And that creates a new touch point that can become a new sales conversation or something. So there's a lot of potential business value that can be extracted from these images. And that's, of course, the goal for us, because if we can't prove the business value, we won't be able to sustain our clientele in the long run, because they'll just drop off.
Yeah, it'll be a marketing expense that's cut
Exactly.
in kind of the ebbs and flow of a normal business. You know what's interesting? I think about, and we had Mike Smith on this show a couple of years ago. He's from a company called Zero Co. And I'm not convinced on the mechanics of how they actually do what they do. They have a whole bunch of kind of household products, and they want you to use the same plastic bottle, and you send in these pouches and they send them back. And I don't know if that's going to be the right model. The thing that they are doing right is that the vast majority of the money that they make goes to fund ocean cleanup. And it isn't just someone out there cleaning up the ocean. It's Mike, the CEO, in the overalls, in the stream somewhere in Manila, actually getting plastic out of the ocean. And like, incredibly powerful, like, narrative and brand story. I guess what I'm curious about is where you have an organization that it has a physical product and is that clearly led. And if you have a company that maybe doesn't have a physical product but says, we love what they're doing, are you starting to see kind of brands interact with each other and overlap and say, we want our work to drive more of what he's doing, for example?
To be honest, we don't see this yet, but I think it is really the potential that we'll have in the future as we scale up, is to be able to bring not only brands together and say, let's do this collectively, and that will reduce costs and kind of increase credibility as well, but also bring impact organizations together and kind of combine different specialties. Like, we have a couple of groups that we work with that are all involved in like water health. So they're providing access to potable water, they're doing sanitation, and these are really big challenges in much of the developing world. And so bringing all of these together into a single value proposition and then go to big funding organizations and say, we have a total solution for water in villages. With sanitation solution, potable water, potentially irrigation, like all of these things. And then say like, now we can, because we have all of this massive network of impact organizations, we can put like $50, $100 million grant proposals together and potentially get those funded by big either philanthropic organizations or like things like USAID or even the Asian Development Bank. Say like, we're going to do this at scale, getting corporate partners involved as well. I think that's really the potential. And hopefully, what you're saying, the getting different companies to kind of join forces on specific goals would be very impactful, especially if they can do it in a way that makes sense to all of them and kind of creates unique advantages to all of them, right? And that's still the challenge, but I think it's going to be possible in the next, hopefully in the next few years.
Yeah, and probably brings me back to probably my last question for the show today on, like, when I think about what Handprint can do, it feels to me a little like it can do anything and everything, which means the challenge becomes what should it do and where should it play. And you've been working at this since 2019, I think you said, and have seen a huge amount happen, not just with the technology the outcomes that you've been enabling with your technology, but more broadly as well. What do you see as kind of the 2 or 3 areas where you're like, these companies, if you don't already have a strategy like this, you should absolutely be doing it? E-commerce feels like one, just given the nature of the product and the transaction that's digitally enabled, perhaps not. Tell me the 2 or 3 that are really front of mind for you.
So I think e-commerce is a very interesting area, but it's proven to be very hard to monetize at scale. And there's also a lot of companies in this space that are specifically focusing on e-commerce. So for us, it's not really a key priority anymore. Now, we still work with e-commerce companies, but it's not where we're focusing on. For us, really, the main focus area is payments and banking. So the financial economy alone is, I don't know, like 100 times bigger than global GDP in terms of transactions, right? So if you can become part of money movement, and that includes just you paying something at a shop to you doing financial transfers, whatever, to your utilities, to anything, then you touch most of the economy 10, 15 times. And I think this is really the most interesting area to be in. So we're in conversations with Visa. We have a big partnership with a bank card company. And so the idea of being in the money movement is, I think, the most powerful. Because if you just imagine that of all your credit card or bank card transactions, 0.01% of monthly value would be dedicated to some kind of positive impact. That alone would be more than enough to cover the $3.4 trillion in shortfall, if everyone would do this, right? And so if companies like MasterCard, Amex, Visa, and other big payment infrastructures in China, like WePay, and so would make this available, we would just solve sustainable development. We'd have enough money to do it. Of course, it would still need to be well spent, but I think the potential there is biggest to create massive impact. And so for us, that's the focal area. Of course, we're working a lot with platforms. I think platforms are really interesting marketplaces because they have this capacity to use our technology to facilitate differentiation. And that's really exciting for them. So think about a platform like Airbnb or Booking.com or another place where you have a very diverse portfolio of supply and where people come to search and make choices, right? So right now we are kind of over inundated with choice. We're very sensitive to price. But that is kind of the main differentiator. People look based on kind of price and potentially location, of course. But if you can add an additional differentiator to this, where you say, this is an organization, this is a host, this is a hotel that has promised that 1% of the money that they earn is going to go to support a local good cause, right? That you can potentially, if you go to that hotel or you go to that Airbnb, you can potentially visit, right? If you make that part of the search parameters, it's not going to affect 100% of people, but it will influence 10, 15, 20% of people, maybe, depending on whatever awareness and interest in these things. And it might direct search towards your listing. So that's super powerful. And that's also very interesting for these platforms that are competing. Like even if you think about like a Booking.com or an Agoda and an Airbnb, they're competing, right? So, and they're all kind of offering very similar services. So if you have this additional thing that could differentiate you from someone else, that might really boost loyalty in your platform. And if you can then give that sense of ownership to the individual, so that on their account, let's say on Airbnb, they can see, well, I've hosted 500 people in the last 2 years. And as a part of this, I have created this much positive impact. I can display this in the search parameters. It becomes a virtuous cycle. And you can do the same for the guest that can also do this. Right? So I think there is a really big potential in these platforms. And so that's really a market we're super interested in as well.
I love it. I want to play part of that back to, I know I said last question, but this idea that you have in the marketplace example, you might have 200 operators who all provide a home in the Blue Mountains that you can come and stay at, but 20% of them say, hey, we sign up for this part of the Airbnb proposition, which means we're giving back to the Blue Mountains that you're about to visit. And therefore, that's what you're coming here to visit. Why don't you support the thing? I find that absolutely fascinating because it kind of, I don't know, it almost, to come full circle, it almost gets back to a capitalistic kind of the best, free market type of ideal that says, if this is important to people, they're going to vote with this thing and do with their best feet. That's fascinating. Simon, I'm really stoked to have got into some of this with you today. I know that we didn't get to all of it. We always get to an hour, which means we're having a good chat. I hope I can make some good intros for you down here in Australia too. I think I've got a couple of organisations who might be interested in it. So
that would be amazing.
Yeah, we can resync in a year or so and see where you're at. But look forward to hearing how it all goes. And thank you again for coming on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me, Vincent. It was a pleasure.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Shape the System. As usual, if you'd like to suggest a guest, someone that you know who's helped change a system for the better, please go to www.shapethesystem.org, click on the top right-hand corner, then click Suggest Guest. Make sure that you click subscribe so that you get the new episode. Shape the System is an independent podcast with support from KPMG High Growth Ventures. Connects founders to the services they need along their journey. Whether you are looking to refine your strategy, mature your finance function, prepare for a capital raise, expand abroad, or simply comply with regulatory requirements, they provide you with the support you need to drive your business forward.